Okay, so we've got this first half of Mark chapter 10. I'm leaving the rich young man for the home groups to look into. So hopefully you'll be enjoying digging into those in your home groups. And if you're not part of a home group, obviously now would be a great time to try and seek out one to join. But otherwise, I can also send you the notes if you'd like to go through what the groups are going to be looking at for the second part of Mark, the rich young man. But this morning, we're going to focus on this first passage on the bit about divorce, mainly because it feels like it's probably easier to address in this kind of setting than to ask people to do that in a home group setting. Now, I realize this may immediately produce a whole bunch of different reactions. For some of you, this is a first-hand experience. I think I've spoken to most of you who are in that situation, but nevertheless, can be a painful topic to talk about. Some of you may perhaps want to be married and are not, and it's painful for another reason. You think, for goodness sake, I want to get married, not talk about how it might end. And I realize that there's a whole range of experiences with regard to this. Some of you, your parents may have been through a divorce, and therefore it's painful there as well. There's another reason that we might perhaps approach this passage in a different way. And we might say, well, actually, this is only really of importance to those who are married and perhaps those whose marriages are in difficulty. So I want to remind us this morning that all scripture is good for us. And I want to give two reasons. There are many more, but I want to give two good reasons why this passage is for all of us this morning. And the first is this, that what each of us believes about marriage, and the same is true for a whole range of topics, what each of us believes about marriage will affect how we function as a community. I mean, us here in the church, I mean, us as a society. It's one of the reasons that the marriage service includes the phrase that marriage was given by God and should be honored by all. How we approach and how we think about marriage, whether or not we are ourselves married, will have an effect on how we interact and how we sow to the community that we're in. It will come out in conversation, in attitudes, in actions. The second reason that it matters to all of us is that marriage is one picture that the scriptures use frequently to explain God's relationship with people. It comes out particularly strongly through the prophets, through Isaiah, Jeremiah, many, many others, Hosea. So as we think about the earthly picture, it affects how we see the heavenly reality, and therefore it matters. The same is true of parenthood. Those of you who had very difficult sort of relationships with your parents will know that skews how you see God. You have to consciously take off the lenses of poor parenting that you've received in order to see God as he truly is. And there are some people who really struggle to relate to God the Father as Father because they have to deal with all of the baggage of poor fatherhood in their lives. In the same way, if we have a poor view of marriage, if we have a low view of marriage, if we don't see marriage as God sees it, then when we see how God commits to his people as a husband to a wife, as if we look to the picture of the heavenly wedding banquet as something to look forward to, we may perhaps not see it as God intends us to. So this passage matters to all of us, not only to those who are married. Some parts of scripture are easy to read and other parts are much harder. And there are parts of the scriptures that are, they're hard to grapple with, but actually we know that the truth underneath them, God's great love for us, his all creating, all sustaining personality, all of those things, those are truths that we really want to understand. There are other places where we read the scriptures and we think this is hard. And in fact, Jesus's own experience was that sometimes he would teach and many people following him would say, this is hard teaching, who can accept it? And they would leave. You can read about that in John, it's chapter 5 or 6, I forget which now. So as we read the scriptures, we sometimes find it uncomfortable, and particularly we find it uncomfortable when God sets his standards high in a way that relates to us. It's fine for him to set standards high in a way that challenges other people, just like it's fine to go over the speed limit as up to the limit that you set, right? And then above that, oh no, that's speeding. And in the same way, when we read the scriptures, I think most of us find it easy in some areas to say, yes, it's great for God to have high standards here, but where it touches on us and challenges us, we find it harder. So I want to remind us at the start of this passage as well, that God does have high standards because he is perfect. And his call to us is, be perfect as I am perfect. But he knows that we are fallen. And his response to that is not to say, do you know what, anything goes. It's actually something much more beautiful and much stronger. First of all, he extends grace and forgiveness. So much grace and so much forgiveness that we struggle to comprehend it. But just as Danny reminded us the other day of Jesus on the cross, Jesus, the glorified one, the one who, when the veil's lifted off, he's glowing white and there's a voice from heaven saying, this is my son. And yet he hung on a cross to forgive us of our sins. That is God's response to our fallenness, grace and forgiveness in unconceivable quantity, more than we can possibly imagine. Secondly, he has endured more than we have. Hebrews says, consider him who was tested in every way and yet was without sin. So God is not asking us to do something that he has not himself done. And thirdly, he says that he won't leave us alone, but he will strengthen us and equip us to live the way that he's called us to live. So if, as we read the scriptures, and it should be the case as we read the scriptures, we sometimes find ourselves cut to the heart because God's ways are perfect and higher than our ways, we have these three things to comfort us. First of all, his grace and forgiveness. Secondly, he has endured more than we have. He's been through it. And thirdly, he strengthens and equips us to live as children of God, to live God's ways. So in some ways, I could stop there, couldn't I? We've read what Jesus says. He's fairly clear, isn't he, in what he says. He doesn't beat about the bush. And we could just leave it there and say, but listen, God's grace is here for those who have fallen. God is here to remind us that he has been through all of the suffering that we can imagine, including betrayal by very, very close people to him, including giving himself up for people who rejected him, and that he gives us his strength. And we could stop there, but there is greater depth that I want to go into. And I want to look at some of the context of this passage in a way that I think will be helpful to us. So first of all, to say this Mark passage doesn't stand alone. There are parallel passages in Matthew 19, that's a much longer one, and in Luke 16, where this whole passage is summed up in a single verse. But the Matthew account in particular gives quite a lot more detail, while the Mark account feels more like a summary, perhaps. In the Matthew account, the disciples then actually have a response to Jesus. And they say, you know, if what you say is true, it's better not to marry. They're clearly deeply challenged, even in that day and age. And I think therefore probably it's likely the teaching is challenging to us as well. But Matthew also gives some extra detail about the argument in question. He's writing primarily for a Jewish audience. And he gives us this point of context that the full question, as Matthew gives it, of the Pharisees is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And this points us to a helpful bit of context. Some of you may have read this because it'll be in study Bible notes. But at the time that Jesus was doing this teaching, there was a big debate going on between two schools of rabbinic Judaism, two schools that had a huge amount of influence in that time. One was a school that followed a rabbi called Hillel. Another was a school that followed a rabbi called Shammai. And they disagreed about a number of points of interpretation of Jewish law. Generally speaking, Shammai took quite a hard line on things, and Hillel took what we might call quite a liberal line on things. And they would argue it backwards and forwards, generally in a good-natured way, but they had very significant differences. And when it came to the question of divorce, they had very different interpretations of the various statements about divorce in the Old Testament, and one in particular that we'll look at in a second. The school of Shammai said divorce was permissible only where there was gross sexual immorality on the part of one partner, generally interpreted as infidelity, but it could also be a couple of other things. Hillel, on the other hand, and his school of Judaism said actually that a husband could divorce his wife for any source of displeasure. And he gave some very trivial examples, which will no doubt quite rightly set some hackles up. You know, if a woman burns her husband's food, then, you know, it's displeasing to him. He has the right to divorce her. Where does this stem from? Well, it takes us back to Deuteronomy 24, What they disagreed about was a particular word in Deuteronomy 24, erva in Hebrew, which is normally translated nakedness. If you want to turn to Deuteronomy 24, feel free, but I'll read this passage to you. It may be helpful to follow it. At the very beginning of the chapter, it's part of a series of laws that are given to God's people through Moses. And it says this: if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent, that's the word erva, I'll come back to that, about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she's been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Now, some of you may have something other than he finds something indecent about her, depending on your translation. And the reason for that is it's a really tough word to translate. The time it's most commonly used is a whole set of laws about who people should not sleep with, where the laws say that you shouldn't sleep with close relatives or with animals and various other things like that. The phrase used is to uncover their erva, to uncover their nakedness. But in this particular context, it's quite hard to translate. You can't say if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to her because she takes her clothes off, probably quite the opposite normally. So it's not just hard for us, actually. The rabbis at the time of Jesus teaching this also found it hard. Hillel's interpretation was to say, well, look, this comes straight after who becomes displeasing to him. So obviously it's something to do with a husband just not finding his wife to be who he hoped, and so he can divorce her. Shammai took the fact that this word erva clearly related to something to do with sexuality, and so he taught it was a reference to sexual impropriety. And so you've got this big debate going on. And in the context of that, the Pharisees come to Jesus, and both Mark and Matthew highlight this. They come to test him. They're not just sort of wanting his opinion on this because they trust him to give a good answer and they don't know what it should be. They come to test him. And there's 2 points to this test. One is that it's one of the trickiest matters of the day. You might imagine perhaps, I don't know, Tim Farron when he was leader of the Liberal Democrats, and you could see the interviewers queuing up to ask him the homosexuality question because they knew that that was something that he was going to struggle to answer without either disavowing his faith or without offending a huge part of his voter base. And so they saw this opportunity, they put him on the spot, and they tested him. The second reason it's a test, if you follow where actually they are at this point, they've left where they were in Capernaum and they've gone to Judea across the Jordan. They're now in the territory of Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas had executed John the Baptist. Well, actually, he didn't execute him for this. He executed him for another reason, which you can read. But he put him in prison because John the Baptist criticized Herod's divorce and remarriage. So it's also quite possible that the Pharisees are seeking to set him up to make trouble for himself with Herod by asking him this question. And Jesus' response is straight away take them back to the scriptures. He points them back to the Torah, to Deuteronomy. Now, the exact way in which he does this is another area where Mark's account and Matthew's account differ if you hold them side by side. So in Mark's, Jesus asks, what did Moses command? And the Pharisees answer, Moses permitted us, ... Matthew actually has it the other way around. Matthew has the Pharisees asking, why did Moses command that a man should write his certificate of divorce? And Jesus says, no, Moses permitted. Now, you can tell the same conversation different ways and it can still be entirely true. You may have found that happening if you've ever reported the same conversation somebody else has. As you try to summarize the backwards and forwards of a conversation, you can pick out different bits and it can sound different but be the same conversation. I don't have a problem with that. What's really important here is that in both cases, what's offered up is a command, and it's refined to, no, this wasn't a command. This was about permission or tolerance. Both affirm the same really important point from this Deuteronomy 24 law, that it didn't command a man to divorce his wife under certain circumstances. It permitted or tolerated it, but it commanded how it must be done. And if you get to grips with this particular law in Deuteronomy 24 and a couple of other places as well, their primary concern is not whether or not somebody should be divorced, but if they are, to make sure it is done in the right way. One thing that was quite common in that time was because the way that society was set up was that a wife was very dependent on her husband for food and for shelter. If a husband decided that his wife was displeasing to him, he could throw her out of the house and she would essentially be destitute unless she could go back to live with her parents. But then a little while later, he might say, actually, no, I'll have you back again now. And she'd have to come back to him. And he could essentially play this sort of push me, pull you game with her, in which he was essentially emotionally abusing and manipulating her. And she had no way out of that because she couldn't marry somebody else. If she married somebody else and said, well, look, I'm separated from him, this previous husband could still demand her back at any time. So nobody would marry her. So she was left in this destitute limbo land, if you like. And to that, the law says, no, listen, you have to give her a certificate of divorce so that it's clear, so that there's a cutoff, so that she is at least free to get on with the rest of her life. And there are various other laws which touch on this. And again, the focus of them is not to do with you should divorce under these circumstances and not under these circumstances, but primarily about protecting people both before and after a divorce. Part of the reason it does this is that most of the laws of the Old Testament are not what we would call in English statute law. So statute law lays out, this is the law, here's how it works out, point A, 1, 2, 3, B, 1, 2, 3. And we have a whole load of statute law in the UK, but actually both in the Old Testament and in UK law, what's far bigger is the body of what's called case law, which says this is one particular situation, this is what the judge decided in that situation, and therefore from this you can draw principles that you should apply more widely. So for instance, in the Old Testament, there's a law, you may have read it, which says do not cook a baby goat in its mother's milk. Now, if you're just going to interpret that at face value, you could say, well, it's fine to do what you like with cows, with sheep, but just not with goats. But clearly that's not the intent of this law. It's not that goats are somehow special and cows and sheep aren't. There's a principle which I would probably think is to do with, and this is my interpretation and some of many others, to do with respecting the bond between a mother and a child, even in the animal kingdom, such that you wouldn't do that. And it would therefore apply to other animals, and it would lead you to have a regard for the mother-child relationship, even in the animal kingdom. It's not simply that one situation, but it's a case that applies more broadly. And so in this case here, this Deuteronomy 24:1 may only cover one specific situation, but actually it expands to give us principles which we can apply more widely. So Jesus corrects their understanding. He says, this is not a command to divorce your wife under certain circumstances, but it is a permission if you're going to do it. It's tolerance if you're going to do it, but here's how it must be done. But then, as Jesus always does, he gets right to the heart of the matter, because he says these words, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce because your hearts were hard. It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. What does he mean by that? Well, I want to unpack this with a picture. You'll have probably all been to a train station, and when you go to a train station and you're on the platform, there's a line, isn't there? Probably about 2 feet back from the edge. And quite often it's got stenciled along it, do not stand over this line. And the point of that line is that trains come through very fast, sometimes not even stopping. Even when they stop, they arrive at speed. And if you're too close, you could get sucked towards from the air currents. You could get knocked against the train, potentially even fall in front of the train. You could be injured, you could be killed. And so there's this line that says, don't stand in front of this line. Now, if you've ever been to one of those platforms with a small child, you'll know that one of the first things they do when they see that line is, what happens if I tread over it? Or perhaps some children say, oh, what happens if I just put my toe up to the line? Can I put part of my toe on the line? Is that too far? Or maybe I'll go mostly over the line, but my heel's still on the line, so I haven't gone past the line, have I? And it's a bit like goal line technology. You know, when is it that it counts as being over the line? And that can be our heart when it comes to the laws and the ways of God. But actually, the purpose of that line is to say, look, there's danger over here, so stay over here. And a better way to interpret it would be to say, well, look, that when the designers of the platform, the train system set this up, they set it up so that we would stand over here out of the way of the train until the train stopped, and then we'd go over there. There's a whole different attitude there. It's not about how close can I get to the line without officially breaking the rule. It's about what was the intent. Okay, I get that. Let's live in line with the intent. So Jesus's point here, and this is something that touches all of us, married or not married, particularly, is this. Hard-hearted people ask, what can I get away with? God followers ask, how do you want it to be, God? Jesus's words here are not, it is never, ever, 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 ever okay to divorce. He gives one specific example in the Matthew passage of when it is permissible to divorce. But his point here is don't seek to find ways to divorce, seek to live God's way. Now, I have to say in this that actually God himself presents himself as a divorcee. You can read it in Jeremiah 3. I mentioned how he uses the marriage relationship to represent God's relationship with his people. And in Jeremiah 3, he says, I've written a certificate of divorce for the northern kingdom, for the kingdom of Israel, and I've sent them away. They have been so repeatedly unfaithful that I have divorced them. I have sent them away. So Jesus's words here are not, it is never, 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 never okay. His words here are, don't seek to find ways to be released from your vows. Seek to live God's way. And then he points them back to the biblical ideal, which is one man and one woman forever. This points to God's nature. God is faithful. God sticks by his people. God has set a celebration ahead of us in the age to come, in which we, his people, will be united with Christ forever, face to face, nothing preventing us from being with each other, nothing hiding us from each other. And God said, this is how it's supposed to be. And he's made the marriage covenant as a picture of that. This is the biblical ideal. Okay, down to nuts and bolts. What does this actually mean for us then? Well, look, some churches do have a little, book or a set of rules that this is what we will and won't do. We do not have such a book. And it might be simpler, but it wouldn't take into account the fact that Jesus clearly says there are some situations in which divorce is permissible. Paul gives another example in 1 Corinthians 7. But those are extreme situations in which the marriage covenant has already been shattered beyond recovery. So rather than set out a set of, here is our rules, here is what we've established, what I'd like to say is, what does this passage say to each of us? What does it mean for us here, where the rubber hits the road at WCC? First of all, what does it mean for somebody in our community who has been divorced and potentially remarried? The answer is grace and no judgment. Even if you were not the innocent victim, and that may well have been the case, you may well have been the innocent victim of infidelity or something like that. Even if you weren't, Jesus calls us to a community of grace and not of judgment. If somebody who had been recently divorced were to join the fellowship, we might perhaps want to have conversations about whether that relationship was beyond retrieval. But we are not about passing judgment on each other for our past. That's not how we want Jesus to act towards us. It's not how he does act towards us. It's not how we act towards each other. Secondly, what does it mean for somebody in the congregation who might be contemplating divorce? Well, I want to say this: Scripture does not leave us at liberty to simply contemplate divorce. It isn't up to us simply to say we're free agents and we can do what we like. It's much, much clearer that God has very, very limited circumstances under which he says, yes, this is fair enough, go for it. They are, as I've already pointed out, situations in which the marriage vows have already been shattered beyond recognition. The one that's clearest is to do with infidelity. Although even then, if you read the Matthew 19 passage, the word that Jesus uses there, porneia in the Greek, is another word like eva in the Hebrew that's very hard to translate. And infidelity is not necessarily the only thing it could mean there. Paul, as I say, gives another example of an unbelieving spouse deserting their spouse as an example where somebody would be free from their marriage vows. But those are very, very specific, extreme situations. So for somebody in our congregation who is thinking about divorce, if you have been the victim of infidelity, if you have been the victim of that total shattering of the vows, we will absolutely walk through you with it. But if there is any way of recovering that marriage, or if that's not the state that it's got to, then my appeal is, let us walk through the process of restoring your marriage with you. God's people are here to help. We have the power that raised Christ from the dead living among us, and that power is more than enough to restore broken relationship. It would be hard, absolutely. It will take a huge amount of effort and love and disappointment, but it is possible. Please allow us to work through that with you. What does it mean to those who are married but not contemplating divorce? It means invest in your marriage. It's valuable, it reflects the Lord's character, and it can do that beautifully. Give yourself sacrificially at each turn for your spouse's good and see them flourish. It is one of the greatest callings of any married person to see your spouse flourish as a child of God. Give yourself to that. That might mean putting aside other things that you value, hobbies, sometimes career. It means being radical about the use of our time, but invest in marriages, see them flourish, see them point to the nature of God. We, his people, want to reflect God. To those who are not married, but hope that they might one day be so, this is some advice I received from some conversations I've had over the last few weeks with people who have been divorced. Remember that marriage is not to be undertaken lightly. Don't assume that if you're both Christians and you get on well and you fancy each other, that you should get married. Prepare well. That the church is a great place for that. There are some fantastic marriage preparation courses which allow you to really explore, is this the right step to take and are we ready for it? And if you are, to prepare well in advance. Make every use of them, please. To those who are not married and don't see that as a likely scenario, there's a call to honor marriage in your heart and in your words. But also, there's a call to remember that the one human being we strive to emulate more than anybody else, Jesus Christ, lived the most fulfilled, the most significant, and the most God-serving life without being married. We've spoken a lot about marriage this morning, but Jesus Christ was not married, and he is the one we all aspire to be like. Your way of life, whether you have chosen it or not, is to be honored and held up within our church community as exemplary. And to all of us, and this is where I want to leave us, remember the yellow line on the platform. In all God's ways, not just relating to divorce, in all of God's ways, let our heart attitude not be, what can I get away with? But how did God make the world to be? And how close can I get to that?